And we really had kind of a clockwork view of the brain where, the brain is composed of a bunch of parts. And if you figure out what each of the parts do, we'll figure out how the brain works. But now the field is very much shifted. Now we're no longer focused on individual parts. It's all about emergent properties. To the extent that you have control over your own thoughts, you need something that's a controlling signal, a top-down feedback controlling signal. And right now, this alpha-beta signal is a good candidate for it. Don't think of alpha or beta as having one function in the brain. It doesn't. What alpha, beta versus gamma is are different energy states of the network.
Good day, everyone. This is Brain Inspired. I'm Paul. My guest today is Earl Miller. Earl runs the Miller Lab at MIT, where he studies how our brains carry out our executive functions, like working memory, attention, decision-making. In particular, he's interested in the role of the prefrontal cortex and how it coordinates with other brain areas to carry out these functions. During this episode, we talk broadly about how neuroscience has changed throughout Earl's career and how his own thoughts have changed along with that. One thing that we focus on is the increasing appreciation of brain oscillations for our cognition. Recently on Brain Inspired, we've discussed oscillations quite a bit. On episode 153, Carolyn Dicey-Jennings discussed her philosophical ideas relating attention to the notion of the self, and she leans a lot on Earl's research with oscillations to make that argument. In episode 160, Ole Jensen discussed his work in humans, showing that low-frequency oscillations exert a top-down control on incoming sensory stimuli. And this is in direct agreement with Earl's work over many years in nonhuman primates. So we continue that discussion relating low-frequency oscillations to executive control. We also discuss a new concept Earl has developed called spatial computing, which is an account of how brain oscillations can dictate where in various brain areas neural activity can be on or off, and hence contribute or not to ongoing mental function. We also discuss working memory in particular and a host of related topics. Show notes are at braininspired.co/podcast/162. Recently, a listener donated a generous amount to Brain Inspired, and when I thanked them, I also noted that if half of my listeners were a tenth as generous, I'd be able to continue doing Brain Inspired indefinitely. Anyway, if you want to ensure that this podcast continues, consider supporting it even for a tiny amount. It helps way more than you know. Learn more about that at braininspired.co. Thank you to everyone who has or continues to support the show. I deeply appreciate it. And of course, I appreciate Earl spending this time with me. And here he is. It's President's Day, so the university is closed. Of course, you're still in lab, but my main pressing question, first of all, is have you played your bass guitar yet today?
Today? No, not today. Tonight, I'll play.
Do you play daily?
Pretty much, yeah.
Do you have a show tonight, or is that when you practice?
No.
Is that
no, it's just my hobby. So tonight I'll be playing alone. I play with a local band here. We used to play a lot before, like regularly before COVID, and COVID sort of knocked everything down. But we're all busy professionals as fellow neuroscientists and neurologists and stuff like that. So we're all busy, so we don't get a chance to play even every week, but we play every few weeks.
So how long have you been practicing playing?
Playing bass guitar?
Bass. Well, I don't know what you started with. Have you been playing instruments since you were a kid?
Yes, I had many years playing trumpet. I was a real band geek in junior high school and high school. So I took private lessons. I was in orchestra. I was in swing band. I was in jazz band. I was in a chamber ensemble. And then I went to graduate school, and sort of everything but science sort of fell by the wayside. And about 10 years ago, I decided I wanted to start playing again. And I still have my old trumpet, but I wanted to pick up a new instrument. I always loved the bass, and I have a bunch of friends who sing and play guitar, and they're always looking for a bass player. So there you go.
Oh, because everyone plays guitar. Yeah.
Yeah. Shake a tree, 10 guitars will fall out.
That's right. That's what I play. I have this guitar hanging right next to me, and I haven't played it in a few days, and I need to get back on it. So maybe I'll just take some inspiration from you.
There you go.
Before we start talking about science, I'm just kind of curious. I've had people tell me in the past that playing music, affects their other cognitive functions, right? So do you feel like musicianship has influenced the way that you move about your science career?
Well, I can't say because I don't have a control group. However, right. I will say that, when you're a kid and you're learning music, it teaches you discipline, it teaches you focus, it teaches you concentration. If you want to get ahead, you got to practice regularly, you got to follow a regimen, you can't just play random stuff. So it really teaches you how to focus and stay on task.
I had a friend who told me that if you play music, it increases the likelihood that you'll become a medical doctor. And I know that you started in like pre-med, right? I
did, yeah. But I think it's true. There's a lot of scientists I notice who play music. In fact, in the Cognitive Neuroscience Society meeting is end of March, and I'm playing in the scientist band Pavlov's Dogs. We're doing a gig at the Hyatt Regency on Saturday, March 25th, 9:30 p.m. in the ballroom, San Francisco. If you're at the Cognitive Neuroscience Society meeting, it's where all the cool kids will be.
Okay. I've never had someone plug music on the podcast. That's a first. That's great. So a recent review that you co-authored on the on working memory begins, over 30 years ago, working memory was solved. Mm-hmm. And so we're gonna talk a lot about your work on working memory. Okay. But just in a very broad picture, how have your views on not only working memory, but just the brain and mind, how have they changed over many years?
Oh, dramatically. When I was a graduate student, back in the 20th century, in the mid-'80s, when I was a graduate student, late 80s, let's be fair, the focus was on the brain's individual parts. State-of-the-art was single electrode recording. You record from one neuron at a time. We focus on individual neurons. We focus on individual brain areas. And we really had kind of a clockwork view of the brain where, the brain is composed of a bunch of parts. And if we figure out what each of the parts do, we'll figure out how the brain works. Now, and things have changed dramatically since then. Not saying that's wrong. There is some truth to that, but also it's foundational. It's a necessary step. You have to figure out the parts before you figure out the whole. But now the field is very much shifted. Now we're no longer focused on individual parts. It's all about emergent properties. What the parts do, the properties that the brain parts have when they're working together as a whole. Things you can't tell by focusing on one neuron or one brain area at a time. And one of those things is things like oscillatory dynamics, which are your brain is awash in these electric fields that are constantly fluctuating rhythmically, anywhere from 1 time a second to 100 times a second or more. And when I was a graduate student, naturally, since we were focused on individual neurons, and oscillations are an emergent property, they were dismissed as like the humming of a car engine. They reflect the engine running, but they don't actually make the engine run. That analogy isn't perfect because actually the vibrations of the engine has to be tuned in order so it doesn't shake itself to death, and so the vibrations reinforce one another. So actually, the oscillations actually do help engines run. But leaving that analogy aside for the moment, it's becoming increasingly clear to us that these oscillations are highly functional, and there's no reason to think they're not highly functional, and there's every reason to think they are. The brain is your brain is an electrical chemical machine. Neurons spike when their membrane potential reaches a certain threshold, and these neurons are resting in other neurons that are creating electric fields. And what do electric fields do when they fluctuate? They're moving the membrane threshold further and closer away to the spiking threshold. You have to be, it's inevitable they are going to have a role in brain function. Mm-hmm. But now that we're sort of moving on to the 20th century, neuroscience was all about the parts. And now it's all about the whole, about the emergent properties, about network properties, and figuring out how things work together. And that's an important part of it.
I know this is an unfair question, but even when I was a non-human primate neurophysiologist, and mm-hmm. even when I started, which was, late 2000s, we were still recording single neurons, Yep. And do you look back on those many years that you spent recording single neurons? Do you look back on it and think, I wish I'd spent my time differently? Or do you think that was like a necessary step as technology, increases? Now we have a different view of the brain, but not all that was like just wasted time, right?
No. That was foundational. You can't figure out how the parts work together till you start figuring out the parts. And it's clear that the first, one big revolution was we used to think every neuron had one function. You figure out what that neuron does, and you'll figure out what every neuron does. You'll figure out the brain. And now we know there's things like mixed selectivity, multifunctional neurons all over cortex. But we couldn't figure out that without going to the first step. So, I don't think of the time we spent recording single neurons as time wasted. There was a time, it was only as recently as 1962 that no one even knew how to make single neurons activate. And people like Mountcastle and Hubel and Wiesel figured that out. We had to get through that. We had to figure out what neurons do in isolation before we could begin to figure out what they're doing in concert with one another. So no, it wasn't a waste of time. It was absolutely foundational. And there was I'm proud of the work we did in the past, and we wouldn't be here if we weren't there.
So you kind of referenced the single neuron doctrine, that the old idea that each neuron has a specific function, is dedicated to a function, and that was like the prevailing view. Was that like a ubiquitous prevailing view, or because that's the view that I have also, that's the history, right? But is it really that clean, or did like the whole field just accept that was probably the way things were, or were there plenty of other ideas floating around?
Well, nothing is ever that clean. I would say it was the modal view in the field. Most people felt that way, but not everybody. I mean, people as early as Walter Freeman, for example, or Donald Hebb talked about the role of electric fields in producing dynamics that integrate the activity of individual neurons. So my PhD advisor, Charlie Gross, used to like to say there are no new ideas, only old ideas rediscovered. But they get rediscovered always. So back then, those people were on the fringe, and now it's more like the common. Now the people who think that single neurons only have one function, they're the ones who are more on the fringe now. But that's the way science works. It's paradigm shifting.
Mm-hmm.
You feel one way, and then the field changes, and we all feel somewhere else with a lot of drama along the way.
Yeah, a lot of drama. What about action potentials? Do you still consider them the currency of the brain? Given have we shifted away from thinking about a spike as the code of the information code?
As the code and the only code, I would say yeah, but they're an important code. I mean, spike. You don't get electric fields, you don't get local field potentials without spiking. So it's all. See, here's the thing: the way we used to think about things was that spiking and spike rate was the only important thing, and all these other things were not doing anything. They were epiphenomenal. They could be ignored. Now we're realizing that it's all of this together is how the brain works. It's spiking and the fields they produce and dynamics they produce and the network properties. So to say that it's all together, it's all that together. It's not just one thing or another. And I don't know. We don't know anything about how the brain works yet. Let's be perfectly honest. We've learned a lot. We've changed a lot in the past 30 years, but there's still a lot we don't know. And to my mind, a theory that explains more phenomenon is way better than a theory that explains one phenomenon and ignores everything else.
I have trouble wrapping my head. So I agree with what you say, thinking about across levels of scale and processes and thinking about it more in a holistic way. But I have trouble wrapping my head around it and having it all in my working memory or something, and feeling like comfortable, like I understand something. It's like I can only grasp at a section at a time. And it's hard to piece it all together. Do you feel like you have it in your head in a comfortable space?
No. The brain is really complex, and we're not going to figure it out in my lifetime. And I've made peace with that. I mean, like everything we're doing now is a stepping stone to eventually figuring out more about how it works. And if the argument is, well, gee, all this stuff is so complicated, we're never going to figure it out, the next 10, 15, even 20 years. Well, you got to get over that, because the brain is not going to be figured out in my lifetime, in your lifetime, even in the lifetime of the next generation of students. We're all just contributing stepping stones to get to a greater truth later. And I'm perfectly comfortable with that.
Well, I mean, you've made a lot of progress in our understanding of the brain, much of which we're going to talk about here in a minute. But there are people who have kind of grand unified theories of the brain. What do you think? Not necessarily of those people, but of are we ready? What you would say is that we're not ready for something like that.
No, not at all. I think all along the way, we got to generate hypotheses. We got to generate paradigms. We got to models, ways of looking at things, frameworks for looking at things, and then we test them. And then when they fall short, we replace them with new theories, frameworks, and hypotheses. So no, I mean, you need people to come along with big ideas about what's going on, just as a way of moving the field forward, even if we're not quite there yet to really have a true unified theory.
Okay, so it's been over 20 years now. I realized, so Miller and Co. in 2001 is this classic paper proposing a function for the prefrontal cortex. And I realized you probably have graduate students now that were born after that paper came out. And I was trying to think back. Feel old. Well, I was trying to think back when I was a graduate student, like if papers that were written like right before I was born, like had a big influence on me. And I'm not sure, but I wanted to ask you, first of all, what the big idea was from that paper, and then how you think and feel that it has held up over the years.
Well, so the big idea, when I first started, I actually started out working in the visual system, and I got interested in prefrontal cortex because of the work of people like Joachim Fuster and Pat Gilman-Urquish. And I was a little more interested in like the higher level cognition stuff. And I felt like when I was working in high level visual cortex, I thought I was looking at the influence of these high level cognitive phenomena on visual processing, but I wanted to get at the heart of the matter. So when I moved up to MIT to start my faculty position, I switched from visual cortex to prefrontal cortex.
Okay, and I was wondering how that came about, because all your earliest publications are all like in IT cortex, infotemporal cortex, yeah.
In Charlie Gross's lab, that's right. And then I did my postdoc with Bob Desmond's lab, and same thing. I moved up to the prefrontal cortex when I started my faculty position. I'll tell you, parenthetically, when I first moved from my assistant professor here at MIT, and I told the department my department head I was switching to prefrontal cortex, I got some blowback from that. They're like, Earl, we hired you to do visual system stuff with our group. And, people who change fields in midstream, they tend not to succeed. And I said, no, I'm going to do it anyway.
That's kind of crazy, because we're just talking about a brain area switch. I mean, that's part of the paradigm shift also is you were talking about understanding the parts, and you are focused a lot on prefrontal cortex, but that's a part of, big networks. And so it's weird to think of it in isolation. And, and it used to be that everyone, I don't know if it's still this way, you can tell me, but everyone kind of had their own special area that they were known for, and other people should stay away from my area. Let me record from that area.
Yeah, I guess that's true to some extent. But when I even when we first, so when I started the lab in 1995, we were first working on the multiple electrode techniques, so we can record from more than one neuron at a time. Yeah. And back then we were still focused on single areas because we only could stick our 1 or 2 or 3, or in that case 4 or 5 electrodes in a single area. But now with the rise of multiple electrode recording, we almost never focus. We may use prefrontal cortex as a fulcrum because we're interested in like higher level cognitive functions, but we recorded in multiple brain areas. Later, our recent experiments are recording like 6 cortical areas and 2 subcortical areas simultaneously, because the brain is networks all working together, and you got to understand how all these things work together if you want to understand cognition. But I think we got off topic here.
Yeah, I was about to bring us back. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So when I started working in prefrontal cortex, the state of the art was working memory. That was the prefrontal cortex does working memory. It holds things in mind. Now just putting that in a little bit of context, that was sort of the way it was felt. The prefrontal cortex is involved in holding things in your conscious mind so you could do stuff with it. Mm-hmm. Even so, the original working memory model wasn't just maintenance. It was also the executive part, the control of working memory. And I remember when I started in the prefrontal cortex, I thought, well, it's got to be more than just holding stuff in mind. And the way I think the one thing we did was that neurophysiology is a bit, I don't need to tell you, neurophysiology is a bit like radar. The signal you get out depends on the signal you put into the brain. And at the time, what people did is state of the art was having animal train a working memory task. And what you vary across trials is what information, what stimulus, what location, what object the animal holds in working memory. And that's what you see from your electrodes, is that stuff varying. The rest of it was all backdrop, right? And I remember I thought at the time, well, this is all very interesting and stuff, but the animal knows how to do this working memory task. How does the animal know how to do the task? That seems to be where cognition is, not the stuff it's holding in mind, but the operations it learned to hold this stuff in mind and respond at the right time and stuff like that. So we started doing something that people hadn't done before. We not only varied what object or picture or stimulus the animal is holding in mind, we also varied the rules the animal applied to it. We've bound in a balanced way, and you can actually compare the two head to head. And when you do that, many more neurons in the prefrontal cortex cared more about the rules of the task than they did about the what the animal was, the content, the information the animal was operating on. So that's what led to Miller and Cohen, was that I thought we had this feeling, well, we got to take the field into this other domain where we understand how the brain operates, how the brain knows what it learns, the rules of the game, how the brain learns what it can do, what it does. And goal direction, executive brain function, is all about identifying goals and coming up with means to achieve them. And this is all acquired knowledge. So that led to this insight that what the prefrontal cortex does is it learns the rules of the game. It figures out how the world works and uses that to, like a puppet master, to direct activity in the rest of the cortex. And this wasn't completely in isolation. There was the bias competition model of Desmond and Duncan, where they said top-down signals select things for visual attention. So it was kind of an extension of that. But I think the main insight was that the prefrontal cortex wasn't learning these rules or the logic of a goal-directed task. It wasn't learning them as an esoteric set of logical operations. It was expressing these logical operations in terms of a map of which circuits in the rest of the cortex you need to activate to do that thing, to follow that rule. So we called them rule maps, because the prefrontal cortex was absorbing the rules of the game, the goal-oriented structure of the world, but was expressing it in terms of what circuits need to be activated in the rest of the brain, as if it was like developed a roadmap, or it was like a traffic cop developing a roadmap once it had this map, it could tell the rest of the cortex what to do. And that's essentially the Miller and Cohen model.
And how do you feel that it has aged? Are you still is there anything that you would have changed about it, or you think you got wrong?
Well, I think the idea that the prefrontal cortex learns rules and learns the goal-oriented structure of the world, I think that's pretty much still true. How it does it's another story. Like, there's certainly there, and we're thinking about writing a review that updates a few things. One thing we've at the time, we underappreciated the role of subcortical structures in this process. The prefrontal, the cortex as a whole, I now view it as an add-on extension and upgrade to the subcortical structures that were already doing a lot of these things before we evolved a cortex. So you can't understand the cortex without understanding, like, the basal ganglion, the thalamus, for example. The goal-directed executive functions grew out of systems for voluntary motor control. It expanded on that, and that's your cortex does. It took these simple functions your subcortex was doing, whether it's voluntary movement or memory consolidation to the hippocampus, and added tissue that could more complex and a lot more tissue that could expand upon those functions. So I would bring in the role of subcortical structures in directing this, and there's evidence that the anterior thalamic nuclei are there to help traffic feedback signals from the front of the brain to the back of the brain, these top-down executive control signals. And the other thing, if we go back to the oscillations thing, is how does the brain establish these pathways? How does the traffic cop tell which circuits to activate in the rest of the cortex? It can't be anatomy alone, because there's lots of synapses in your brain, and it takes a long time to change those synapses. It takes a long time to build new pathways in your brain. So that's where I bring in the role of oscillatory dynamics. That's what we think what oscillation is doing. We think of we think of the cortex, brain anatomy as not being destiny but possibility. Brain anatomy is like the road and highway system. It just says where traffic could go, and your thoughts are where traffic actually does flow from moment to moment. And something's got to direct that traffic. And we think these patterns of oscillatory resonance, neurons that hum together, temporarily wire together, these shifting patterns of oscillatory resonance are what actually determines where the traffic flows on the infrastructure of its anatomy. And I'll say one last thing before we move on, is sure. People, when I say this, people say, "Oh, you're saying anatomy is important." No, anatomy is important. The traffic doesn't go anywhere without the infrastructure, and the infrastructure is constraining about where you build new roads or you tear down old roads. That's very, very important. But cognition is going to be about how all this activity dances along all this infrastructure anatomy. And that's what these emergent properties do, is they control their large-scale oscillations, oscillatory dynamics, local field potentials, electric fields. They are large-scale organized changes of neuronal excitability. And that's going to be the kind of thing that to my mind, has to be the thing that allows a sort of flexible direction of thoughts that we associate with executive brain functions and high-level cognition.
Well, there's a lot of metaphors that you threw out there, and another one that you frequently use is guardrails. You think of oscillations as guardrails for that traffic, but the traffic is still action potentials. You still think of that as the main currency, traffic.
Yes, I do. I think that, again, without spiking, you don't have anything. And these large-scale organizations of excitability are going to sculpt where the spikes flow and which neurons become activated. In fact, we have a paper that's just about to come out, a new theory called spatial computing.
Oh,
and
I was going to ask you about this.
This is sort of an extension of Miller and Cohn in the sense that, well, how does the brain use this large-scale changes of excitability? How does it use that to do things? And the idea is that the way your brain does computation is by controlling where information is expressed in its networks.
What you guys call spatial computing. Let's go ahead and get to that. So I recently had Ole Jensen on the podcast talking about, and in his case, he focuses on alpha oscillations, but I mean, it's basically alpha, beta, these really slow oscillations as being a top-down controlling signal, much like you have developed in your own work. Whereas there are these high-frequency gamma oscillations that are more the currency of incoming sensory stimuli that are being controlled by the alpha-beta guardrails, right? And so you ascribe to that story, but spatial computing is on top of that, is a much more nuanced location-based ability. How do the alpha beta waves know where to go and what to do, right?
Well, first of all, let's back up a moment. And when we talk about alpha beta waves, first of all, in frontal cortex, it's beta, but we've done recordings that record all over cortex. Right. And as you move backwards in cortex, the frequencies drop a little bit. So high gamma becomes slightly less high gamma and beta becomes alpha. Now, probably when we learn more about the brain, we'll learn more about the subtleties of different frequency bands, alpha, beta, or whatnot. But the other thing to keep in mind about alpha versus beta or this is that those are arbitrary frequency bands that someone made up 150 years ago. So they don't necessarily correspond to any real functional difference. The difference will be between lower and higher frequency oscillations. And think of them as don't think of, I think Ole Jensen would agree with me, don't think of alpha or beta as having one function in the brain. It doesn't. It's good for a particular function in the brain, which is top-down control. What alpha, beta versus gamma is are different energy states of the network. Okay, when neurons are spiking at a moderate rate, you get the frequency in the alpha beta range. And then when there's a sensory input, there's more energy coming in, there's more spiking, then things fly up to the gamma range. So think of it as alpha, beta, or gamma as different energy states of the network. And the way you control gamma is by forcing networks into either allowing networks to express that energy state to gamma, or you can use alpha or beta to force networks in certain locations in cortex to go down to a lower energy state, and that prevents gamma from happening. So that's the idea. And the idea behind spatial computing is that the idea behind spatial computing in a nutshell, and it's hard to express in a nutshell.
You can take your time, that's fine. Yeah.
I'll try, is that the information about the contents of thought, the things we see, the things we think about, motor command, the sensory information, the nuts and bolts, the primitives of how we perceive the world, that's all stored in the brain in cortex in high frequency components, and the details of how individual neurons are wired together. And they're expressed repeatedly all over cortex, all over cortical networks. Think of all these ensembles corresponding to like a picture of an apple, for example. They will be expressed multiple places redundantly all over cortex in local and in global networks, right? And what think of those representations of stimuli as being like grains of sand in a big sandbox. And what? Let me
clarification question. Just so literally, like let's say Apple has 1,000 different repeated network structure motifs in your brain. Is what you're saying? Okay,
that's the idea. Sorry, that's the idea. So you'll be Apple expressed all over the place. So now what alpha and beta do is they control. Alpha basically are a pattern signal. They're a pattern signal to being imposed on cortex. And wherever alpha beta lands in cortex, that forces a local network down to a lower energy state. So now gamma can't be expressed. Okay? And places where alpha beta isn't is where gamma can be expressed. So think of this pattern of alpha beta as kind of a photographic negative of where you want information to be expressed in cortex. So now let's go back to the grain of sand analogy. You have all these apples, oranges, all this stuff expressed repeatedly in multiple grains of sand all over this big sandbox. And the alpha beta signals, this pattern signal, is acting more on a macro scale. So now think of a checkerboard or patchwork expressed on this grain of sand, on this sandbox, right? So now, if I have one pattern of this checkerboard or patch pattern on this sandbox, then only certain parts of that sandbox can express apple or orange. And if I switch the pattern of this patchwork, then other parts of that sandbox will express apple and orange. So that's why we think computation works. So one way to think about it is like, imagine I set up an animal in a task where the animal is simple task. The animal has to remember 2 pictures in the order in which I present them. So apple and orange, or orange and apple, or apple and house, a house and apple. You get the idea. So here's how it works. So the brain's already been trained on this task. It knows the operation. So here's what happens. So now the first stimulus is about to come along. And what the brain does is set up this pattern of alpha beta so that, and let's keep it very simple. Let's say there's just 2 patches, right? I'll put multiple hands there, okay? So you have 2 patches. And one pattern of alpha beta activation corresponds to slot number 1 for the first object. So the first stimulus comes along in this task, and the brain shifts its alpha beta pattern to create this patch where the first stimulus is going to be expressed. So the first stimulus comes along, it's apple, and all the neurons in that patch that where the gamma is or beta is where everything else is, they go apple, apple, apple because the animal's seeing the apple, right? And they get primed. Then the second stimulus comes along, and the brain shifts to another alpha beta pattern, and now a different patch corresponding to slot number 2. It's allowed to express the representation of the second stimulus that comes along. Let's say it's orange, 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 right? And now at the end of the delay, the animal has to recall, or me for that matter, which stimulus was first, which one was second, apple, orange. You recreate the alpha beta pattern that corresponded to apple, and all the neurons that first got activated when the apple was seen were primed. Now they can say apple, apple, apple. And now I want to recall the second stimulus. I shift to a new alpha beta pattern, and the neurons that were primed by orange can now express their activity and say orange, orange, orange. So that's the brain does operations. Its operating system works, its computations work by controlling where information is expressed in cortex. Now, no doubt that's going to be way too simple, but at the end, the brain represents information. Doesn't have calculating circuits in the brain as far as we may have a few, may have some, but representing information is a major way the brain does things. So it seems to me that a lot of its operating system should be in the control of representation.
I asked Ole this also, and he said that he couldn't get rid of the homunculus. And so, the question is like, well, if we're using alpha beta to configure the system and certain control and configure the content, where does that control come from? Do we still have the homunculus problem?
If I had the answer to that question, we would have the brain all figured out. We could all go home. So yes, obviously it's not going to be homuncular. It's going to be an emergent property. And what is that emergent property of? Well, I'll do some hand waving here. There's recurrent anatomically closed loop connections between the prefrontal cortex and the basal ganglia and thalamus. And there's a big influx of dopamine, which signals reward and reward prediction error. So it could tune up these, first of all, when you see dopamine, dopamine can be a permissive signal. The gating signal allows the brain to change and form these representations that you needed for high-level control. And the closed anatomical loops between the places like the prefrontal cortex and subcortex, whenever I see closed anatomical loops in the brain, I think recurrent processing. I think the bootstrapping operations, right? Recursion, that's the word I was looking for, recursion. Think of bootstrapping operations. So think about the anatomical loops between the prefrontal cortex down through the basal ganglia, back through the thalamus, back up the cortex again. It's like a snake eating its tail. There's these channels going through. There's some crosstalk, but there's some channels going through there. And when you see something like that in the brain, what I think is recursive processing. The system can learn something through one iteration, and then when it changes, that becomes fodder for more material for another iteration. And it's got to be something that's open-ended that way, some sort of bootstrapping recursive process that allows the open-ended nature of human cognition. So control must come from some tuning up of these recurrent processing, these bootstrapping operations that allow the brain to form these higher and higher representations that contain information about how to achieve goals. If you think, we've done a lot of work on how the brain learns categories and concepts, cat versus dog, numbers, same versus different. If you think about it, if I can identify a cat I've never seen before, I can now generalize across all the cats in the world, and I have some template or some representation of my brain of what a cat is. Well, goal direction, if you can generalize among a bunch of individuals in the present, it's the same process that allows you to generalize to the future. So I think it's the same parcel of the same operation.
I recently also had Carolyn Dicey-Jennings on the podcast, and she leans a lot, she's a philosopher, and she leans a lot on your work with Tim Bushman about, this alpha, beta, control, oscillations story, to argue that we have a self, that's evidence that we have a self. And I know you were just doing some hand waving, and we don't need to go down a long hand waving conversation, but I just wondering if you had any thoughts on that, since I asked about, where the control comes from, and then I remembered her philosophical work suggesting not necessarily that it's coming from the self, but that this is evidence for a self.
Well, it's beautiful, and I love that work. That's really, really nice work. I guess it all depends, and I'm about to get hand wavy here, how you define self. But how do you define self? I don't know, but I like, how do you define free will? This is a question we actually take up in one of the classes I teach. But to the extent that you have control over your own thoughts, you need something that's a controlling signal, a top-down feedback controlling signal. And right now, this alpha-beta signal is a good candidate for it. And again, I wouldn't say, but I don't want to give anybody the impression that, alpha-beta does this one thing in the brain, it's executive control. The alpha-beta is an energy state that's useful for executive control. And we could talk about why its low frequencies are better for executive control than high frequencies. It's probably because low frequencies are better for organizing, large-scale organization of because it's also, when you have low frequencies, also larger spatial extent, it's good for organizing, large-scale organization of excitability in the brain, right? I mean, if you look at a pond when it's raining, there's a bunch of like it's drizzling a bit, there's a bunch of high-frequency ripples in the pond. But if a boat goes by, that boat's going to swamp out everything else with its wake. So that's probably why low frequencies are more associated with executive control, because they have a way of overriding and organizing behavior, neural activity on a large scale.
You also talk about the idea of dimensionality, and I mean, this goes back to the spatial computing, right? So you have this like really high dimensional neural activity, which is the content, and then you have this alpha beta control, right, that is controlling that content. And you've written about it as if that alpha beta is serving as guardrails to funnel information along a lower dimension. And is this why we have access to only one or two things in our head at a given time? Is that related to the funneling and how we can access the content?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll get to cognitive capacity in a second, but I want to just, when you talk about the guardrails, one extension of this work is, so we've worked a lot on spiking and LFPs. And by the way, the idea that LFPs, obviously LFPs are going to have a causal role in where spiking occurs, because you look all over the brain, you see spiking phase locks to different oscillatory phases of ongoing LFP oscillations. So it seems like, it is organizing Sorry, go ahead.
Does everyone agree with you? Is that a ubiquitous agreement in the field that LFPs are causal, or because some people might still say they're epiphenomenal, right?
Yeah, well, no, of course, but this is where we get into paradigm shifting and Thomas Kuhn. People feel that way, I think, because they're still kind of like the vestiges of this old way of thinking about things, that spikes and everything and individual neurons are everything. I mean, this is just physics. I mean, the electric fields work both directions. I mean, everybody agrees you can read interesting information from LFPs and even electric fields. They say, but it can't work in the other way. It just works one. No, that's not the way physics work. If you have these electrical fields and you can read information from them, it works the other way too. And it's pretty much inevitable, And when I say that, people say, oh, but you look at, you record from a single neuron in a dish and you see the action potential is huge and the LFP is small. Well, yeah, that's a single neuron. Your brain is not a single neuron. Your brain's a gazillion neurons all smushed together again, all interacting. And, these effects add up in a very nonlinear way. And I'll put it this way. These fluctuations in electrical fields, they're so strong that we could measure them outside the skull 150 years ago using crude equipment. And you're going to tell me that doesn't have an influence inside the skull? No way. Of course it does. And also I was on Twitter the other day, and somebody, I wish I remember their name and give them credit for it, but someone posted on Twitter an EM photograph of 3 neurons together, right? And the 3 neurons are together, and their axons are forming synapses, they're dendrites. Right? Mm-hmm. But these 3 neurons, their bodies are smushed together really, really tight. The dendrites and the axons are around it like a halo, but the neuron bodies are smushed together. In fact, the neurons, they flatten their bodies out so they have maximal contact between the soma. There's no synaptic transmission going on there. You're going to tell me neurons smushed together like that because everything is all spiking in synapses and releases neurotransmitters? Obviously not. Sorry, so that was a sidetrack. What was the question again?
No, that's okay. Well, we were talking about the dimensionality and the capacity that these signals, yeah.
So lately what we've been working on with my colleague Dimitris Panosis at University College London is that we're taking these neural activity like LFPs and we're extending it up a little bit to electric field, near electric fields in the brain. Now, when I say electric fields, I'm not talking about electric fields you read, 10 feet away. I'm talking about near electric fields hovering around all this activity that neurons are doing. And what Dimitri showed quite elegantly in one paper was published last year is that if you look at things at the electrical field levels, near electric field level, you can read the contents of working memory just like you can with single neurons. But here's the thing, no representational drift, little or no representational drift. Those electric field signals are steady, trial to trial to trial. And if you record on the single neuron level, you know this as well as I do, you get massive representational drift. You could record from 100 neurons, 1,000 neurons, 1,000,000 neurons individually. And if you do the same trial 20 times in a row, you'll get 20 different patterns of activity. Do it 1,000 times, you'll get 1,000 different patterns of activity. The neurons, think of the brain as like a giant orchestra. The neurons are individual players, and the melody plays on, but the individual players come and go constantly. Right?
This is a real pain when you're recording single neurons all day.
Yes, exactly. But when you get this higher level of electric fields, now you're starting to get organization on a useful scale, and you're getting organization that's stable, and there's no representational drift. So cognitive function is going to be at the level of this melody playing. It's not going to be the level of individual players because individual players come and go constantly. And if you want to have top-down control, executive control of thought, you can't do it on the level of individual players because they're fickle. They come and go constantly. It's got to be on the level of, if you will, if I may carry the analogy further, orchestra sections, this larger scale organization of activity. And that's where the LFPs and electric fields come in. And it's not to say that the neurons aren't important because you can't get there without the spiking activity in the individual neurons. But I think that's the level in which a lot of interesting stuff happens because that's a very extremely useful level, the level of electric fields and LFPs.
I think I've heard you talk about, there's the proverbial spotlight, or you look for your keys under the lamppost, and that's what we were doing when we were under the single neuron doctrine and recording single neurons and talking about that. I mean, we're just under a different lamppost now, but is it just a wider field of view, or do you think that lamppost will change again in the future? Now that we're thinking of like these higher order LFPs and larger scale and high dimensional recordings and so on.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this goes back to what I said earlier about us being stepping stones. I mean, the single neuron rate coding model was the dominant paradigm back in the 20th century, and now we're more into this emergent property paradigm. Well, someday this paradigm will be replaced too, and it'll be something else. Now, do I feel inadequate or depressed that one day the paradigm I'm working under will be replaced? No, because we can't get to that future paradigm without going through this one first. So we're all just stepping stones, and we all got to kind of make peace with that. and this is straight out of Thomas Kuhn. I mean, like, science is always this tension between tradition and rebellion, right? Tradition in the sense that you got to propose things that are reasonable. I'm not going to say that, spirits are controlling my executive functions. I'm going to say something reasonable like electric fields are because the brain's electric. So that's reasonable. That's the appealing to tradition. It's got to be something that's plausible. But at the same time, it's rebellion because the job of science is to move forward beyond the current paradigm. So, we can't get too stuck in our current paradigm. And when people say things like, LFPs and oscillations, they're epiphenomenal. No one knows enough, not you, me, no one in this world knows enough about the brain to say something like that is an epiphenomenon. When I hear something's an epiphenomenon, when someone says something's an epiphenomenon, I hear that doesn't fit my model.
But we have to have those models, right? Just to think about anything.
Yes, that's right.
It's a frustrating thing knowing that all of our models are wrong.
Oh, absolutely. All our models are wrong, and some are more wrong than others, though. But like right now, everything I'm telling you, maybe long after I'm gone, 10, 20, 30 years, and people say, "Oh, that's not the way things work." It's there was some truth to it, just like there's truth to the individual neurons and spiking and rate coding. That plays an important role in brain function, but it's not everything. And what I'm proposing now is not everything either. And one day people will see it's not everything and there'll be a new paradigm, but that's just the way science works. You can't hang on to old paradigms. If you want to hang on to old things, then join the clergy,
I know that we're on an aside, but this is fun. So I'm going to stay on it for a moment before I bring us back to capacity, which we never talked about. But you've often talked about how, you think that this is a paradigm change that you have experienced throughout your career, going from that clockwork-like single neuron function view of the brain to now a more holistic. Has that, and of course, a paradigm shift is not a real thing, right? That's a model or a metaphor itself. But, we can think of it as a real thing. Do you think that has been accompanied by a shift in thinking in a reductionist manner, or is neuroscience still predominantly in a reductionism sort of regime, and should it be, if so, or if not?
Well, reductionism is important, especially in a new science, especially when you figure out something that's complicated in the brain, because again, you got to figure out the fundamentals, how things work. I would say we're still in a reductionistic phase. We're just less reductionistic now because there's still a lot to figure out the brain, and there's still a lot we don't understand. So we're still kind of in almost the cataloging sense that we're figuring out, we're describing phenomenon and cataloging them, and we're putting them together into models and paradigms and frameworks. But they're only, our current theories are things to use to generate and test hypotheses. They're not things to be cherished and preserved.
Well said. Okay. All right, let's get back to capacity. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about working memory is because, and I don't think that we've even mentioned this yet, the old way of thinking, the classic way of thinking about working memory and how it works in brains is that you, while you're thinking of something, your neuron concerned with that thing, apple, is active throughout the period that you're thinking of it, maintaining it in working memory. And then when you're done with thinking of apples, then that neuron goes quiet. And that is the classic story based on neurophysiology recordings and other means. And that's the story that has changed over time. And so this is kind of like what we're going back to talking about the oscillations. And maybe you can say a word about the capacity of our content versus our ability to access that content.
Well, I think we're talking about two things. We're talking about the capacity and we're talking about the story about working memory, the working memory model. And they're related to one another because the capacity enters into working memory. But stepping back for a moment, the view of working memory used to be persistent activity. You're thinking about something and neurons are spiking. And then when you stop thinking about it, they stop spiking. Well, that largely is and by the way, that's a 50-year-old model from 1971. So I think you'd be hard-pressed to argue that we figured out everything 50 years ago, especially something with high-level cognition like working memory. We figured out 50 years ago, and nothing has essentially changed. That's just no way. But that view is largely a vestige of the single neuron approach, because what do you do when you record from a single neuron? You first of all when I know this because you and I both spent a long time doing this. If you only can record from one neuron at a time, you're looking for neurons that do something interesting. So first of all, you're biasing your sampling towards the property you're looking for. And then what you do, because you're only recording a single neuron, is you record 30 trials or 25 trials and you average across them and get the average activity. Well, all that averaging of activity masks all these interesting dynamics that are going on because averaging throws all those dynamics away. And now that we're recording from many electrodes simultaneously, we can't select individual neurons so we're doing more random sampling. And we're having enough power now, statistical power, to look at things on the individual trial level, what happens in real time. And what happens in real time is not persistent activity. You find that the bulk of neurons, they fire just periodically, and there's lots of pauses during these memory delays. Now, so now that's not to say that spiking during memory delays is, again, there's always truth to the old story, and this spiking during memory delays does underlie working memory. It's just not persistent spiking. There's something much more complex going on there. There's sparse firing. There's this interplay of these alpha, beta, and gamma dynamics as they go back and forth. There's periods of spiking with gamma, then alpha comes along and then shuts it down, and then it gets re-expressed again. That's what actually goes on if you look in real time and across many neurons during performance of a working memory task. It's much more complex than we thought. And so the question is, how does the brain maintain memories when the spiking is only sparse and there's gaps in time with no spiking? Well, that comes from actually one of the last papers of Pat Goldman-Kish, one of the pioneers of neurophysiology working memory. She and her colleagues identified short-term synaptic plasticity mechanisms that when a neuron spike, they potentiate synaptic weights for about a second based on calcium dynamics. And that's the current thinking, is that's what's going on, is the neurons spike periodically during this memory delay, but then the spiking has a temporary change of synaptic weights that essentially leaves an impression in the network of the spiking pattern that just occurred. Then after a while, the system's got to spike again to refresh those weights. Okay, so that seems to be the way that state-of-the-art about how working memory works.
So it needs to spike about once a second then to do that, or it spikes and it sets the weights and then they're stored in what are called silent synapses, perhaps, which we can talk about in a second. Or it doesn't matter. The next time it spikes, it'll reactivate that short-term weight. Is that how it works? So it doesn't have to be once per second?
It doesn't be once per second. And if you're holding multiple, again, the capacity thing, if you're holding multiple things in the mind simultaneously, then it may not be, you have different spiking of different representations. In fact, that's one of the ways we think that it may work. So the problem with persistent spiking, the way you model persistent spiking is something called attractor dynamics. Attractor dynamics is a state of pattern of activity in a network, right? Well, one thing computational modeling has shown is that attractor dynamics are a really bad way to do working memory because if there's any overlap in two attractor dynamics, they smush together and you lose the information. And one thing we have learned about higher level cortex is that there's not isolated representations of one object versus another. There's mixed selectivity and multifunctional neurons. There's a lot of overlap in representation. So one thought about why the brain works this way is, first of all, lots of spiking costs lots of energy. You don't want the brain spiking constantly, so sparse spiking is better. But beyond that, if you're trying to hold multiple things in mind, say 2 or 3 things in mind simultaneously, with this sparse spiking, you can activate the one representation, then the other, then the other, then the other, and they don't overlap in time, so you don't have this problem of attractor dynamics smushing together and messing things up. And that's one explanation of why we have this capacity limitation. There's only so many refresh rates you can have between spiking activity without the representation smushing together. So that's one explanation. The other explanation that is not mutually exclusive, could both be, is that because it's becoming increasingly clear that cognition is rhythmic, not just working memory, but cognition in general. For example, we've shown this with alpha beta dynamics, and there's constant shuffling going back and forth between alpha, beta, and gamma. And people like Sabine Kastner, for example, at Princeton, she has studied sustained attention. The animal has to pay attention to a stimulus on a computer screen, or location computer screen, because there's going to be a faint target there, and you got to catch that target as soon as it occurs. Sustained attention should be the most sustained thing ever in the brain. And when you look at it, it waxes and wanes in theta 4 times a second. Both behaviorally, the animal's better at detecting the target than worse, than better than worse. And those mirror the theta LFP oscillations going on in cortex at the same time. Now, if you really think about it a lot, it makes a lot of sense, because if I have sustained attention, sure, I want to pay attention here, but I can't ignore everything else around me. So these periodic oscillatory dynamics allow the brain to free up for a moment and check everything else to make sure nothing else is going on that needs attending. So it makes sense the brain would work in this rhythmic way. And plus it does. I mean, your brain's like a big rhythmic machine, and it's the most obvious signal you record from the brain. So it's come increasingly obvious to many of us that the brain works not by continuous analog computation. It works by squirting these packets of information periodically around cortex in these oscillatory. So there's a packet sent and paused and packet sent. That's what these oscillations are doing. And if that's the case, that means everything for the current contents of consciousness have to fit into one oscillatory cycle. So that's explanation. And if you think about it, actually, because neurons have a refractory period, it's actually got to be half a oscillatory cycle.
Mm-hmm.
So when Marcus Siegel was in my lab a number of years ago, Marcus Siegel and Melissa Warden published this paper where they had the animal hold two pictures in mind simultaneously in their order, much like I described to you earlier with the spatial computing. And what they found was that there was these 30 hertz oscillations in prefrontal cortex, and spiking that represented the first object versus the second object lined up on different phases of the 30 hertz oscillation. So what the cortex was doing was juggling this picture 1 and 2, picture 1, picture 2, and the cortex was juggling them 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 30 times a second.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the phase offset is. It's a juggling act. The brain's juggling, get both my hands in the picture, juggling them 30 times a second, right? And if that's the way the high-level cognition works, well, there's only so many balls you can juggle in one wave.
Right. What is so? I'm kind of conflating the idea of different frequencies of oscillations, high frequency and low frequency in the range, with dimensionality. And I'm thinking, is low frequency, does that mean low dimensionality, and high frequency, is that a more high dimensional signal? Does that make sense?
No. That's not the way we think about it. The information expresses in these neurons, the spiking of neurons and the connections between neurons forming engrams, and that's where the dimensionality is. And dimensionality comes from the mixed selectivity neurons that allow high dimensionality or allow dimensionality reduction depending on task demands. The way we think about the oscillations is that they're a way of controlling the ongoing activity in the brain, not so much to do with dimensionality reduction or dimensionality expansion.
But okay, but I thought you had said that the low frequency oscillations are essentially take that high dimensional neural activity and funnel it into a lower dimensional state. Do I have that wrong?
Oh no, you're right. Also, yeah, in that sense, yes, I see what you mean. So when you're controlling, when you have a bunch of high dimensional information that could be expressed in your brain, and you're using these alpha oscillations to funnel or guideline, provide these guide rails, you're actually narrowing the focus of activity toward a smaller amount of information. So in that sense, they do engage in dimensionality reduction.
Okay, yeah. So,
but I was talking about more after the information has already been expressed. What's high dimension versus low dimension?
Right. How low dimensional is our thinking, is our conscious subjective experience? So if you can keep 3 to 4 or however many things in working memory, do you think about our cognition, which is rhythmic? Do you think about it in terms of a certain band of frequency?
A certain band of frequency.
Well, are we alpha? Do we think in alpha? Do we think in theta? Like you were, if that is
no, we think with the combinations of all these things. They're all doing different things. Like the gamma and spiking of high energy states, or information is being expressed. Alpha, beta helps control that, and theta. You get down to theta. Theta probably has multiple functions too. Like all the rest of these bands of oscillations. And one thing theta does is that gamma in cortex is often cross frequency coupled to theta. And one idea for computational modeling is theta is helping pace when gamma can be expressed, and alpha beta sort of sculpts on top of that. So it's a way of, again, another way of moving representations out in time so you don't overlap with one another.
Okay, so
thought of all of this together. I would never reduce thought to just one frequency, one band, or one anything.
Yeah, but isn't there, I really thought, and I can't remember the source of this information, that there was a proposed rhythm of sort of our subjective ongoing thoughts, right, happen at within some range of oscillatory frequency, right? Like switching to thinking from cats to dogs, and it's not instantaneous, and it's not everything all together.
Well, a lot of this stuff is going to depend on the demands of the task at hand. For example, the sustained attention task I was talking about that Sabine Kastner performed, where the attention is waxing and waning at theta. The animal has to make a behavioral response, so that's going to slow down the system a little bit. Tim Bushman did a study in my laboratory where he studied covert attention. Now the animal has to search for a stimulus in an array of stimuli, like a Where's Waldo kind of thing. Only the animal is not allowed to move its eye. It has to search with its mind's eye. So now you're not worried about something physically moving. So now the system can move quicker. And we found that the spotlight of attention that was searching, the mind's eye, the eye is still, but the mind's eye, the spotlight of attention moving around, searching for the stimulus, that was operating around 20 hertz at a higher duty cycle. And probably because, so the brain adopts whatever frequencies it can use for the task at hand. And when the system can work quicker, it's going to use a higher frequency. And when it has to slow down because of things like physical limitations, you're going to get a slower frequency.
All right.
And one thing I want to mention, I keep thinking when I haven't got a chance to slip it in yet, is that, there's something called multiple realization in the brain. Everybody's brain isn't wired the same way. Right? So you look at something like Eve Marder's work at Brandeis, where she's studying the how pyloric motion, how food moves down the digestive tract of lobster, I think it is.
Lobsters and crabs, yeah.
Lobsters and crabs. And there's like 3 ganglion. I may be getting some of these details right, so correct me if I'm wrong. There's like 3 ganglion, and she found there's something like 50,000 ways you could tune up these 3 ganglion to produce the exact same function.
Yeah.
And if you look, all of our brains are going to be a little different. So the principles are going to be the same, but the exact details of how stuff is done is going to vary a bit from person to person. That's why I don't want to get hung up on, beta versus alpha. It's probably the relative frequency is going to matter, not a sharp dividing line. And all of our brains are going to be a little bit different.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Eve Marder, because you talk about this in terms of anatomy as possibility, not destiny. And that is alongside the multiple realizability idea. And that's something I've sort of shifted in my thought, becoming more interested in the idea of capacity as a principle, right? Instead of thinking, the nature of the relationship between structure and function has always plagued neuroscience, right? But if you start thinking of structure more as possibility or capacity, that kind of frees you up a little bit, or me, in my thinking about it. And I just think it's a beautiful principle.
Yeah. And you ask why we are so single-minded. We are incredibly single-minded. I mean, when you say the humans can hold 4 or 5 things in mind simultaneously, that's under the best of circumstances. When you're testing somebody with a bunch of colored squares on a computer screen, just which color changed. When it comes to real complex thought, we are incredibly single-minded. So there's at least when it comes to consciousness and cognition, there is a single-mindedness and a single track kind of thing, something that funnels activity in a way that allows us to engage in things we're consciously aware of. And that seems to be highly limited in capacity. And it may be due because you need to funnel this information in a certain way along this infrastructure of the road and highway system. So that's people often, parenthetically here, one thing I used to give this public lecture on how you shouldn't try to multitask because you can't.
Right.
And no one can, we're very single-minded creatures. And our brains crave information. Our brains evolved in an environment where there wasn't a lot of information available. We only could direct action on one thing at a time. So our brains probably evolved with those kind of constraints and said, okay, this is the job at hand. So why not be single-minded? I'm getting anthropomorphic here, but why not be single-minded? Why not develop this way of doing cognition that's single-minded focus? So we didn't really need much of anything else at the time. We didn't grow up in this. We didn't evolve. Our brains didn't evolve in this environment where there's everything available simultaneously, all vying for our attention. So why do we have a capacity limitation for consciousness and cognition? I don't know. It's the way our brains, we could explain now using these things like kind of the explanations I gave them, how the brain operates and why that would be the case. But why it got to this case, why it evolved this way, maybe just life is like a Kurt Vonnegut novel. Things happen randomly and everything changes,
But why do we want to multitask? Well, if multitasking is so suboptimal, why do we seem to want to do it if we're just screwing ourselves over?
Yeah, and that's because, again, this environment our brains evolved in. We evolved in an information-poor environment where, there wasn't a lot of things to pay attention to, but something that comes along, some information might be really, really important, like the rustling in the bushes could be a tiger's going to leap out at you. So our brains also, it's a paradox. Our brains evolved, it's a single-mindedness, but we also evolved this thirst for new knowledge because new knowledge was adaptable. It was adaptable and may save our lives. So that's why. And now we are in a very different environment that our brain's involved in, where there's not, it's not information poor, it's information overloaded. So we crave it and we can't help ourselves because our brains evolved to think that, any new information must be really, 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 really important. And we can't turn it off.
But in reality, Twitter is useless.
I'm not going to,
Okay, I thought I could get you on there, but okay. All right. I'll just state it then. All right, Earl, I'm aware of our time, but there are a couple more things about working memory that I would love for you to just discuss a little bit, because our conception of working memory has changed through this, what we're calling a paradigm shift. One idea that I'd love for you to discuss is the idea of silent synapses. And I know that you guys worked with this and built a recurrent neural network that with and without short-term synaptic plasticity, like you were talking about, and found some effects of the short-term synaptic plasticity based on these silent synapses. So what is the idea of a silent synapse? And then maybe you can discuss that work.
Well, in this work, what we do, we ask the question, how is it that the brain can hold things in working memory through these gaps in time of no spiking? That's where these silent synapses come in. So what the spiking is doing is sort of temporarily setting synaptic weights, leaving this impression so that when another bolus of activity comes in, the neurons now express the synapses now express the information they have. And we started that work by trying to solve a simple question, like what are the mechanisms that allow the brain to hold things in mind consciously with these gaps in time? And when we tested neural networks with or without the old way of thinking, persistent activity, attractor dynamics, no synaptic plasticity, just neurons are constantly spiking. We compared those models against models that had short-term synaptic plasticity. And what's interesting is that both tasks can solve the working memory. In the case of the attractor dynamics, as long as you're holding one thing in mind, it can solve working memory. Once you put a second thing in there, all bets are off. So that's something else we could talk about. But they could solve a simple working memory task. But what we found is that you add in this short-term synaptic plasticity, and there's all these other benefits that had little to do with working memory, are good for network functioning in general. Adding in the short-term synaptic plasticity makes networks deal with noise better. So that you could add noise into the input, and it doesn't bother these networks once they have the short-term synaptic plasticity. They can deal with the noise. And the other thing it does, it allows graceful degradation of networks. So in our study, when we had our models that had persistent activity alone, attractor dynamics, if you randomly delete as little as 10% of the synapses, then the network falls apart, can't do the task anymore. But you add in the short-term synaptic plasticity, and now you could blow away 40% of the synapses, and the network is doing just fine. And graceful degradation has got to be the way your brain works, because your brain's constantly shuffling and losing neurons. I know mine is. So that's an important principle of networks. So just right there tells you there's something must be going on.
Well, you mentioned Goldman Rakesh and alongside the idea of silent synapses, but I thought Mark Stokes had a lot to do with the idea.
Oh, he did. Yeah. No. Pat Goldman Rakesh, I'm talking about. She had this one paper, one of her last papers before she was tragically killed by a car crossing the street, and she showed this in slices from the prefrontal cortex that there's these calcium dynamics that can do short-term potentiation of synapses. Mark Stokes really gets a lot of credit for really introducing the idea of activity silent model into working memory, and he showed in a series of really elegant work that you get not only is working memory activity silent, like we're describing, activity then quiet, but also the persistent activity, the attractive dynamic model is you it's like a latch circuit in the brain. The stimulus comes along, you flip a light switch, and activity simply maintains that stimulus as it is until the memory delay is over. Well, Mark also showed that it's not the case at all. If you really look carefully and look at groups of neurons, you can see the representations of what the neurons are doing are constantly shifting and changing and evolving over time. So it's working memory is not persistent, it's activity silent, and it's not steady state. It's a lot of changing and shifting dynamics. And everything that we've done since Mark first proposed this activity silent model has supported that. We see the same things. So, Mark Stokes tragically died recently. He was a real pioneering researcher, and he was one of these people who, he was bold enough to stick his thumb in the eye of dogma, something I obviously appreciate. He was bold enough to stick his thumb in the eye of dogma and try to tear down dogma, but he wasn't just a naysayer. He actually followed it up with really elegant work that supported his point. Yeah. So he will be sorely missed.
Yeah, I read that he recently passed as well, because I think it was cancer, right? So thinking about the dynamics, we talk a lot about dynamics on this podcast, and you were talking about how they're constantly shifting. And looking at the dynamics is possible because of these high dimensional recordings that we can now do, where we're recording tons of neurons. And so that's what another thing I was going to ask you about to describe is when you guys look at the dynamics, you see like different subspaces, and the different components of working memory are shifting. And this is where the goal comes in, and that the actual decision to make a decision, to make a movement or something, that the dynamics switch between from encoding to the moment of decision. Maybe you can describe that much better than I just butchered it.
Yeah, the subspace coding is really interesting development. It's something that we're starting to look at. Tim Bushman has done some excellent work on subspace coding, really elegant stuff. Like in one study, he has the animal pay attention to a stimulus, ignore another one in one condition. That's visual attention. And a working memory task where you give the animal two stimuli in the middle of working memory delay, you say you can forget one of those. And what he shows is that the cortex goes into his different subspaces, one for relevant stimuli and one for irrelevant stimuli, parks things in the relevant subspace domain when you don't need to pay attention. It doesn't get rid of it, puts it, because who knows, who knows what's going to happen in the future. You may need it again, but the brain sort of parks it in this subspace. And he has a recent paper which found mind blowing. It's in bioarchives, hasn't been peer reviewed yet, but he shows that different cortical areas in different subspaces can simultaneously talk to other cortical areas in different subspaces at the same time. And you read something like that and you think, God, yeah, that's the way the brain should work. Yeah, it's got to be complex like that. So the subspace stuff, for many, many years we talked about, just changes in rate coding. Visual attention is an example. Yeah. I pay attention to something, and there's lots of activity to that stimulus. And I ignore it, and there's little or no activity to that stimulus. And it was all just more activity or less activity. Now it's starting to feel like we're looking at the shadows of the cave wall, if I may use another analogy, and that we're looking at a impoverished glimpse of what's actually going on. And the subspace coding is it's more rich, it's more complex, and seems to be more attuned to the kind of things that the brain would need to do. Now, what subspace coding is, people don't know. Essentially what it is different patterns of activity. If you have a certain pattern of activity across a group of neurons, that's one subspace. A different pattern will produce another subspace. So it's not just which neurons are activated or how they're activated. It's how they're activated in relationship to one another, what patterns they form. And that's another example of an emergent property that we could not get by studying one neuron at a time.
How high dimensional are subspaces? How many subspaces can we have?
That's a good question. Don't know. I mean, this work is fairly new. I guess that's something else that could feed into this question of why do we have capacity limitations in cognition.
Do you think that the dynamical systems theory approach, studying the dynamics in these different state spaces and subspaces, do you think that has ushered in a new neuroscience era? And sorry to add another kind of question to that, but some people think that it's sort of a stepping stone to thinking about cognition, tying neural activity to cognition. We should think more in terms of relating thoughts and cognition to these sort of dynamical substate spaces than to the activity of a bunch of neurons.
certainly that's what subspace coding is all about. It's looking at another dimension of, it's not just neurons firing when they fire. It's these patterns of firing and how they form this emergent property of a group of neurons working together. And if subspace coding didn't happen now, it was bound to happen inevitably, because the brain's got to be working that level of complexity. It can't just be individual neurons turning on and off and conveying information. It's got to be something in the configuration of which neurons are firing. And that's what a subspace code is.
What do you think how do I ask this? So I asked you about your 2001 classic, which is, what is it, like the top 5 most cited neuroscience papers? Is that still correct?
Last I checked, 5th most cited paper in the history of neuroscience.
Man,
but who's counting?
Yeah, that's right. First of all, I don't know if this is going to sound rude or not, but do you feel like, like when someone writes a hit song, right, and then they don't have another hit song for, decades, not that you've been writing hit song after hit song in science, don't get me wrong. Are you saying I haven't had any hit songs since 2001? Let me back up. No, I'm just. So what are we talking curious, about then? I'm curious how you view that. I don't know how artists view it when they have, like, their most popular song, right, is they wrote 30 years ago or something, and they've been putting out great work. They got sober and they're still putting out great work. No, I'm just kidding about the sober. But I'm wondering, like, how you reflect on that, and then what you think moving forward, if you're like itching to write another paper that, whether that just gets cited as much, right? I'm not talking about the quality of your work. I'm just talking about the reflection on, like, what you want moving forward and how you reflect on that.
Well, I'm not trying to chase glory here. I'm trying to chase science. And I'm thinking about doing an update to the Miller and Co. model where we bring in all these other things like subcortical structures and loops between them and things like oscillatory dynamics that help sculpt activity. That would be the update. I hope. The Miller and Co. The essential idea is still correct, but now it's a matter of it needs an update, because that was very much still in the vein of, like, rate coding still and
right,
simply, right. So now I'm thinking about an update where we bring in all these new ways of thinking about the brain. It's not like, we're saying that the original model was wrong. It's just a way of extending it and updating it. Everything needs to be updated. Science is constantly moving forward, and especially something that's 21 years old now. Yeah, damn well should be an update at this point.
And you could cite it again if you do an update to it.
Yeah, that's true. I should start writing.
Yeah. But moving forward in your own career, how do you view the rest of your career playing out? I mean, are you going to continue? Are there things that you are interested in that you have not studied in the past that you want to shift to, despite your the faculty saying you shouldn't, for example? Or how do you view the rest?
We're well beyond that. We're well beyond that now.
Yeah. Did they apologize, by the way? Did they ever apologize?
No. No, I mean, they can't tell me what to do anymore.
Oh, I know.
Only granting agencies can do that. Only study sections can do that. Sorry, what was the question again?
The question is, how do you envision the future of your own career and your interests, and how you picture yourself moving forward?
Well, I don't mean to be glib, but I'd say more of the same. One thing we're very interested in doing is, since I'm interested in oscillatory dynamics, I want to see if I can manipulate the oscillatory dynamics and see if we can get changes in the brain that correspond with predictions of our model. So we're now about to start a series of investigations where we're doing a closed loop electrical stimulation. Our lab developed a new ultra fast read-write closed loop stimulation. Closed loop stimulation is when you read the oscillations from the brain, then you match stimulation to those oscillations. And to do that, you need a real fast read-write latency. So our lab developed a new closed loop stimulation system that's just now being installed, where we can, if the read-write latency is below 10 milliseconds, so we can manipulate a lot of different frequencies, a lot of different from low to high. So we're very, very interested in doing that. Having said that, I just talked about a causal manipulation in the brain where we do that. But having said that, we also have to keep in mind that, people causality is not simple in the brain. People think causal stuff is, you just do something and something happens and you have the answer. No, causality is not that simple in the brain. It's actually much more complex than people think. And causal manipulations are another tool. They're not the gold standard. They're just another tool in our toolkit. And like here's an example that my PhD advisor used to talk about, Charlie Gross. Like for example, let's say I record from the cortex of an animal and the animal's performing a task. And I hit the animal on the toe with a hammer while it's performing the task. Well, the animal is going to stop performing the task and neural activity in cortex is going to change. Are you saying there's a causal link between the big toe and the cortex? No, obviously, because people often, here's the logic that people often see, and you see this over and over again. They'll manipulate one area of the brain, A, they'll record from another area of the brain, B, and they'll study behavior. So they change A, activity in B changes, and behavior changes. So they go, that must be the causal link, A to B to behavior, right? But what if instead it's A, you change A, that changes behavior, and behavior goes back and changes the activity in B? That's equally plausible. Now, I'm not saying let's throw out all causal manipulations. I'm saying that we have to think about them in a judicious way because they're important tools, but the effects of causal manipulations are not as straightforward as people think. So we just got to think of them as another tool, not as a gold standard. And having said that, if I may go on, people often say, well, about oscillations. Why can't you do a study where you causally manipulate the oscillations and shows it has a causal effect on brain function?
Yeah, this was
Sure, that's what we're trying to do. But all these people who are saying this, they're the people who are still vested in this old rate coding single neurons. And I say to them, okay, can you do a study where you change rate coding in the brain and don't change anything else and it changes function? No, you can't. No one's ever done that study. That hasn't happened. The moment you inject current into the brain, you maybe think you're using a rate coding model, but the moment you inject current in the brain, you're changing the LFPs, you're changing the oscillations, you're changing electric field, you're changing everything. So the kind of causal manipulations that the oscillation naysayers are looking for, their own model doesn't hold up to that kind of scrutiny. And that's where now we get back to Thomas Kuhn and paradigm shifting, holding the new model up to a higher standard than your own model. There are no causal manipulations in the brain that prove the rate coding model either.
Have your ideas about causality changed over the years since that old rate coding clockwork-like view of the brain? Because I think I used to have a naive idea about causality, and now I'm awash in thinking that almost everything is causal, like a constraint is causal, context is, it's like everything seems causal in some way.
Well, I think it's a good open-minded attitude to have at this point because we only scratch the surface how the brain works. So right now, any plausible mechanisms out there should be considered to be a possibility, not an epiphenomenon that can be ignored. That's just paradigm defending.
All right, Earl, I appreciate all the time you've spent with me, and good luck with the band moving forward, and of course the science. Not that you need luck with either, but thanks for talking working memory. And we didn't talk much executive function. We didn't get into the executive function aspect of working memory, but another time perhaps. So anyway, thanks for your time.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure.
I alone produce Brain Inspired. If you value this podcast, consider supporting it through Patreon to access full versions of all the episodes and to join our Discord community. Or if you want to learn more about the intersection of neuroscience and AI, consider signing up for my online course, Neuro AI, The Quest to Explain Intelligence. Go to braininspired.co to learn more. To get in touch with me, email paul@braininspired.co. You're hearing music by The New Year. Find them at thenewyear.net. Thank you for your support. See you next time.